Procrastination is the only spiritual discipline that everyone naturally masters. No need for courses, gurus, or meditation apps. You simply sit, take a deep breath, look at the important task, and decide that later is more zen than now. It's a refined art. First, you postpone. Then you justify the postponement using Eastern philosophy you don't even understand properly. I'm living in the present, you explain to your boss while ignoring 17 emails. Everything is impermanent. You meditate while watching the deadline approach like a spiritual tsunami. Buddhism has become the most sophisticated alibi in history for those who discovered that running away from responsibilities can sound profound. Centuries of wisdom transformed into an excuse to sit in lotus position and decide that spreadsheets are Maya illusion. You're not avoiding work. You're practicing detachment. You're not being irresponsible. You're cultivating presence. You're not procrastinating. You're following the natural flow of the universe, which coincidentally flows very slowly when it involves doing something useful. It's genius. Transforming laziness into a spiritual journey, negligence into contemplative practice, and chronic lateness into applied millennial wisdom. Nothing like explaining that you missed the deadline because you were too present in the moment to remember that the future exists. And if you've already used meditation as an excuse not to answer important messages like this video, if you've already transformed Buddhist philosophy into justification for not doing anything productive, subscribe to the channel. If you've already discovered that poorly applied Dharma is luxury procrastination, hit the bell. Because today we're going to meet 3 people who perfected this art, who discovered how to use ancestral wisdom to avoid modern responsibilities, and who learned eventually that true Buddhism doesn't run away from life. It just teaches you to procrastinate with more awareness. Roberto Now was a productivity specialist, a profession that consists of teaching busy people how to become more busy, more efficiently. He had spreadsheets to organize other spreadsheets, apps to monitor productivity apps, and a calendar so optimized it scheduled time to breathe. It worked perfectly until the day he lost 3 clients in the same week, all for the same reason delicately explained as lack of alignment in deliveries. Translation: Roberto delayed everything while demanding punctuality from others. The irony was crystal clear. The personal efficiency guru had become a classic case of advanced procrastination. Like a nutritionist who only eats pizza or a personal trainer with a beer belly, Roberto discovered that preaching productivity doesn't automatically make anyone productive. That's when he found a book about mindfulness in an airport bookstore. The power of now was there, shining. Like divine revelation among gossip magazines and overpriced gum, Roberto flipped through some pages during the flight and had an epiphany at 10,000 meters altitude. Living in the present. That was the secret missing from his life. No more anxiety about the future, no more regret about the past, just pure presence, total awareness of the current moment. How had he not thought of this before? It was as obvious as discovering that water is wet. Roberto arrived home determined to completely revolutionize his professional approach. No more running against time. Now he would flow with time. No more stress about deadlines. Now he would embrace each moment as a sacred gift that the universe offered for free. The following Monday, he sat at his work desk and decided to meditate before checking electronic messages. 10 minutes of conscious breathing to start the day centered. The messages could wait. They had always been there. They would always be there. What mattered was being present for each inhalation and exhalation. After meditation, Roberto looked at his inbox with Zen serenity. 47 unread messages. Normally this would cause immediate panic followed by triple coffee and frantic typing. But now, he had Eastern wisdom on his side. Only now exists, Roberto murmured to himself. These messages are projections of future anxiety. I'm going to focus on the present. And he closed the laptop, because answering messages wasn't living in the moment. It was getting lost in worries about things that hadn't happened yet. Instead, Roberto decided to take a meditative walk around the apartment. Each step should be conscious, each movement a celebration of presence. He walked slowly through the living room, through the kitchen, through the hallway, observing how his feet touched the ground with Buddhist reverence. During the walk, the phone rang 3 times. Roberto didn't even answer. Phone calls were interruptions of full consciousness. Whoever calls is always talking about past or future, problems that already happened or deadlines yet to come. None of that mattered to someone genuinely living in the present. At lunchtime, Roberto prepared a sandwich with total attention. Each slice of bread was observed as a work of art, each layer of ham contemplated as a Tibetan mandala. Eating slowly, chewing consciously, savoring each moment of the meal as deep, gustatory meditation. The sandwich took 40 minutes to be consumed, time that Roberto would normally use to answer messages while swallowing anything without paying attention. But this was exactly the trap of modern life, doing several things at the same time, never really being present in any of them. In the afternoon, Roberto tried to work on a presentation for a client. He opened the slide program and stared at the blank screen. Creating slides was projecting future scenarios. It was anxiety materialized in colorful points and graphs. How did this align with living in the present moment? He decided to meditate on the question. He sat in improvised lotus position in the office chair and closed his eyes. If the answer was important, it would come naturally. Forcing creativity was exactly the kind of violence against the present moment that he wanted to avoid completely. He meditated for 2 hours. When he opened his eyes, the screen was still blank, but Roberto felt deeply centered, more connected to himself than he had been in years. The presentation could wait, the client could wait, the whole world could wait. What mattered was that Roberto had finally discovered how to truly live, how to be present for each breath, each heartbeat, each precious moment of existence. For the first time in decades, he wasn't chasing after something. He was simply being. Roberto turned off the computer at 3 in the afternoon, not out of laziness or lack of motivation, out of wisdom, for understanding that true productivity comes from true presence. And true presence didn't rush to deliver presentations that only fed the hamster wheel of unbridled modern capitalism, including his own career. 2 months later, Roberto discovered that living in the present included some inconvenient experiences, like receiving a call from the bank at 8 in the morning, like finding a bailiff at his door, like discovering that his checking account had also entered a deep state of Zen meditation. The bank wasn't practicing detachment. Apparently, account managers weren't adepts of the philosophy that money is energy that flows freely. They had very specific concepts about energy flowing back to the financial institution, preferably with updated interest. "Mr. Roberto," said the attendant on the phone, "your account has been negative for 6 weeks." Roberto breathed consciously before responding. "Numbers are arbitrary human constructions. My true abundance cannot be measured by digits on a screen." There was an awkward pause. "Sir, you owe 32,000 reais." Roberto felt a small contraction in his stomach, but quickly returned to presence. "Owing is a concept that creates suffering. I prefer to focus on what I have: health, consciousness, free oxygen." The attendant didn't seem impressed with free oxygen as bank collateral. Roberto began to notice that other people weren't following his spiritual journey. The building doorman made strange faces when Roberto explained that condominiums were artificial divisions of unitary space. The supermarket attendant didn't accept payment in universal gratitude for sacred food. Worse still, former clients were calling, not to hire new services, to ask where were the projects they had paid for in advance. Roberto tried to explain that projects had been transcended. that he had evolved beyond material deliveries to offers of personal growth. "I paid 15,000 reais for productivity consulting," shouted a client on the phone. "You gave me 5 hours of guided meditation on conscious breathing." Roberto remained calm. "Conscious breathing is worth more than 15,000 reais. It's priceless. You received something infinitely more valuable." The client hung up on him. Clearly, she wasn't ready to receive gifts from the universe. Roberto began to experience strange symptoms. He woke up with a strange sensation in his stomach. Not spiritual hunger, not existential emptiness. Real hunger. The kind that asks for physical food, not metaphysical insights. He opened the refrigerator and found Buddhist philosophy, Zen wisdom, and absolutely nothing edible. Apparently, supermarkets didn't accept barter of spiritual teachings for basic food products. Roberto decided to meditate on the food question. He sat in lotus position on the empty kitchen floor and focused on breathing. Maybe fasting was part of the purification process. Great. Spiritual masters always went through periods of food abstinence. After 3 hours of meditating, his stomach continued making not very Zen noises. Very materialistic, very corporeal, very insistent sounds. Roberto tried to accept the noises as natural mantras of the body, but they seemed to be asking for rice and beans, not transcendental enlightenment. That's when a letter arrived from the apartment owner. Eviction for non-payment. Roberto read it with anthropological interest. Eviction was a fascinating concept, as if someone could be removed from the space they consciously occupied. "Space is infinite," Roberto murmured. "Apartment is an illusory division of infinite space. No one can evict me from the universe." But the legal document didn't seem interested in Buddhist cosmology. It had deadlines, amounts, and very specific threats about forced change of address. Roberto called his mother. First time in 2 months. "Mom, I'm going through deep spiritual transformation," she sighed. "Roberto, are you unemployed again?" "I'm not unemployed. I'm beyond employment. I've transcended the need to exchange time for money. Son, you need to eat." "Mom, food is temporary bodily fuel. I'm feeding on eternal wisdom." "Eternal wisdom doesn't pay the electricity bill," she replied with devastating maternal pragmatism. Roberto tried to explain that electricity bills were part of the capitalist control system, that human beings lived thousands of years without electricity, that candles were more romantic and ecologically sustainable lighting. "Roberto," his mother interrupted, "do you want to come have dinner here today?" He felt a wave of inexplicable gratitude. "Can I bring dessert?" "You can," she said, "but bought, not philosophical." During dinner, Roberto explained his spiritual journey in detail, how he had discovered that productivity was a trap, how linear time was a mental construction, how presence was the only authentic state of human existence. His father listened to everything in silence. At the end, he asked, "And how are you going to pay the bills?" Roberto sighed. "Dad, you didn't understand anything I explained." "I understood," his father replied. "You discovered how not to work and called it spirituality." Roberto was offended. How to reduce transcendental journey to simple, disguised laziness. How not to see the consciousness revolution that was happening. But during the third portion of his mother's lasagna, a tiny doubt began to grow. What if living in the present included some inconvenient responsibilities? What if true presence encompassed more than meditating while running away from commitments? Roberto pushed away the heretical thought. It was ego resistance, fear of abandoning spiritual comfort zone. But the planted doubt, small as a Zen seed, began to germinate. The following week, Roberto woke up on his mother's couch for the 5th consecutive time. Not because he wanted to, because the bailiff had materialized the abstract concept of eviction into very concrete forced change of address. His mother brought breakfast with that face mothers make when their 40-year-old son returns home, talking about spiritual enlightenment. Roberto, you need to get a job. Mom, employment is voluntary prison of the creative soul. Creative soul needs to pay child support, she replied, showing a letter from his ex-wife's lawyer. Roberto had completely forgotten about child support. In the last 2 months, living in the present, his daughter's financial future had been neglected in the name of conscious presence. Apparently, the judicial system wasn't interested in the father's personal growth. It wanted punctual monthly bank transfers. Julia needs money for school, his mother continued. She doesn't need a Zen father who can't pay for her lunch. Roberto felt something strange happening in his chest. It wasn't a chakra. Opening, it was old familiar guilt trying to pierce through spiritual armor. I'm going through a transformation process, Roberto explained, more to himself than to his mother. Great changes require transition periods. Transition doesn't feed an 8-year-old child, his mother replied with maternal surgical precision. Roberto decided to meditate on the question. He sat in the backyard, closed his eyes, and tried to connect with inner wisdom about how to reconcile responsible parenthood with authentic contemplative life. 20 minutes later, the only revelation was that mosquitoes don't respect meditative state. That's when his cell phone rang. Unknown number. Roberto, this is Carlos, remember? From the logistics company. Roberto vaguely remembered. Client he had abandoned in the middle of a project when he discovered mindfulness. I'm calling because I need that consulting, urgent. Carlos, I don't work with traditional consulting anymore. Roberto began. Now I focus on consciousness development. Roberto, Carlos interrupted, my company is going bankrupt. I lost 3 big contracts. I need to reorganize everything in 2 weeks or I close the doors. Roberto felt something moving inside him. Not Zen compassion. Old responsibility, somewhat rusty but still working. Carlos, I'll pay 50,000 if you solve this. Carlos cut him off. 50,000 cash. Silence. Roberto looked at his mother's house. Thought about his daughter's child support, remembered the lost apartment. 50,000 reais were very material, very concrete, very capable of solving very specific problems. I can take a look, Roberto said, trying to sound casual, but only as a personal favor. I'm not going back to corporate life. Roberto, help me. There are 200 employees depending on this. Roberto hung up and stood still in the backyard. 200 employees, 200 families, real people with real bills and children who needed real lunch at real school. How did this fit into the philosophy of living only in the present? He began to understand something inconvenient. Living in the present didn't mean ignoring future consequences. It meant being aware of how present decisions affected other people. True presence included responsibility for the impact of one's own actions. Roberto called back, Carlos, I'll help you, but I'll do it differently this time. How differently? I'll be present for each process. I'll really understand what your company needs. I won't apply a ready-made model. Roberto, I don't care how you're going to do it. I care about results. You'll have results, Roberto promised, but results that take people into account, not just numbers. In the following days, Roberto applied mindfulness in a completely new way. Instead of meditating while running away from spreadsheets, he meditated within the spreadsheets. He observed each number as representation of real human life. Each line of the spreadsheet was someone's salary, some family's livelihood. He discovered that true mindfulness didn't avoid work. It made work with total consciousness. Each decision made considering real impact on real people. Each process reorganized thinking about facilitating the life of whoever needed to use that process. Roberto worked 16 hours a day for 2 weeks, not out of old neurotic compulsion, out of presence dedicated to what really mattered. He was present for real urgency, not running away from it. The difference was subtle but revolutionary. Before, he worked anxious about future deadlines. Now he worked conscious of present need. Before, he stressed about results that didn't exist yet. Now he focused on the quality of each action at the exact moment of executing it. When he delivered the finished project, Carlos was impressed. "How did you manage this so fast?" "Total presence," Roberto explained. "When you're really present, you don't waste time with anxiety, procrastination, or distraction. You just do what needs to be done." Carlos paid 50,000 the same day. Roberto looked at the bank deposit and understood something fundamental. Money wasn't abstract energy flowing freely. It was a concrete tool to take care of concrete responsibilities, to pay for his daughter's school, child support, new apartment. Roberto had discovered practical mindfulness, presence that didn't run away from life, but embraced it completely, including inconvenient parts like bills, deadlines, and people depending on him. It wasn't less spiritual. It was spirituality that worked in the real world. 6 months later, Roberto had created a completely new methodology. Conscious productivity was presence applied to real responsibilities, not running away from work by meditating, working while meditating. Each task became an opportunity to practice mindfulness. Answering electronic messages with total awareness of each word typed, having meetings present for clients' real needs, creating spreadsheets as if each number represented human life, because it really did. Roberto discovered that true mindfulness didn't eliminate deadlines. It made deadlines less stressful. When you're present for the task being executed now, you don't get anxious about delivery that will happen later. You simply do what needs to be done, moment by moment. The difference was crystal clear. Before, he meditated to escape from responsibilities. Now, he meditated within responsibilities. Presence wasn't escape from life. It was total immersion in life, including boring parts like taxes and Monday meetings. Roberto went back to paying child support on time. He rented a new apartment. He won back old clients, not because he abandoned spirituality, because he found spirituality that worked when tested by reality. Living in the present includes taking care of the future, Roberto explained to new clients. True presence doesn't ignore consequences, it embraces them consciously. His daughter spent the weekend with him for the first time in months. "Dad, you're not weird anymore," she said. "I'm Zen," Roberto replied. "Really Zen this time." Because Roberto had finally understood spiritual procrastination isn't spirituality. It's laziness with incense. Authentic Dharma doesn't run away from life. It transforms how you live it, even when it includes spreadsheets. While Roberto learned that mindfulness includes inconvenient responsibilities, on the other side of the country, a university student was discovering that impermanence doesn't prevent permanent consequences. Because if there's one thing students do better than coaches, it's transforming deep philosophy into creative excuse for not delivering academic work on time. Julia Transition was in the 6th period of psychology when she discovered she knew absolutely nothing about herself. Perfect academic irony, studying the human mind while her own mind went into complete breakdown about the meaning of existence. The problem started with TCC, course completion work, pompous name for research that no one will read about a subject no one asked for an opinion on. Julia needed to choose theme, advisor, methodology, schedule. Basically, plan 2 years of academic life while having no idea what she wanted to do in the next 2 minutes. The anxiety was paralyzing. Each decision about TCC seemed to determine eternal professional destiny. Choosing wrong theme meant ruined career. Inadequate advisor meant inadequate guidance forever. Wrong methodology meant wrong life methodology for decades. It was during a panic attack in the library that Julia found a book about Buddhism among statistics manuals for academic research. When Things Fall Apart was there, like divine revelation among piles of dusty dissertations about behavioral disorders. Julia, Flipped through the chapter on impermanence and had instant illumination. Anika. Everything is transitory. Everything changes constantly. Nothing remains the same forever, including anxiety about TCC that was completely consuming her life. If everything was impermanent, why despair about academic decisions? Professional career was impermanent. Diploma was impermanent. The university itself was impermanent. In 100 years, no one would remember whether she had graduated or not. Julia left the library with a sensation of transcendental lightness. She had finally found adequate perspective to deal with academic pressure. Impermanence wasn't a depressive concept, it was total liberation from neurotic expectations about the future. The following week, Julia approached the TCC question with completely new Zen serenity. She met with a possible advisor and explained Buddhist philosophy about impermanence. Research themes were transitory. Scientific knowledge was impermanent. Today's academic truths would be refuted tomorrow. The professor was confused. She asked about research schedule. Julia explained that schedules were human attempts to control illusory linear time. Real time was cyclical, organic, impossible to be compartmentalized into artificial semesters. When the professor insisted about deadline for project delivery, Julia smiled with compassion. Deadlines were arbitrary social constructions. If everything was impermanent, deadlines were also impermanent. Delivery dates would pass, just like anxiety about delivering on time. Julia spent the following month meditating on impermanence instead of researching bibliography. She sat on campus, observed students running to classes, and felt sorry for their ignorance. All trapped in illusion of academic urgency, all believing that grades mattered eternally. During meditations, Julia contemplated how everything at university was transitory. Buildings would be demolished. Professors would retire. Students would graduate and be forgotten. Knowledge taught would be surpassed. Even diploma hanging on wall would yellow and lose relevance. Why chase after something so impermanent? Why stress about deadlines that existed only in collective imagination of people who didn't understand transitory nature of reality? Julia began skipping classes. Classes were artificial fragments of knowledge presented at arbitrary times. True knowledge was continuous, timeless, impossible to be divided into 50-minute periods. Colleagues asked about TCC progress. Julia explained about impermanence with maternal patience. They were suffering unnecessarily from attachment to transitory academic results. TCC would be defended, approved, or failed, and then forgotten forever. When the first deadline for research project delivery arrived, Julia didn't even show up at college. She was at home, meditating on how deadlines were temporal violence against natural flow of existence. First deadline would pass, just like second, third, and last. The advisor called asking about delayed project. Julia explained Buddhist philosophy about detachment from results. Project would be delivered when universe signaled appropriate moment. Forcing artificial schedule was resisting cosmic wisdom about natural timing. Julia cancelled enrollment in 3 subjects. Subjects were artificial divisions of integrated knowledge. Why study statistics separate from philosophy? Why learn scientific methodology isolated from spirituality? True knowledge was holistic, impossible to be compartmentalized. Her parents called worried about low attendance reports. Julia tried to explain that attendance was irrelevant quantitative concept. Quality of presence mattered more than quantity of hours, sitting in chair listening to professors repeating information available for free on internet. At the end of the semester, Julia had failed 4 subjects for absence, but she felt deep peace about academic situation. Failure was impermanent experience. Approval would also be impermanent. Diploma would be impermanent. Professional career would be impermanent. What mattered was understanding about transitory nature of everything. Julia had finally found wisdom that liberated from artificial social pressures about academic performance. including pressure about graduating on time. Second semester, Julia returned to college with completely renewed approach. No more anxiety about grades, no more rushing to deliver assignments, just serene presence for impermanent educational experience that would end anyway. Julia transformed classroom desk into improvised Zen altar. She brought discreet incense, small crystals, and books about Tibetan Buddhism. While professors talked about psychological theories, she meditated on impermanence of all psychological theories. Freud was impermanent. Jung was impermanent. Skinner was impermanent. In 50 years, all current psychology would be seen as primitive as Victorian phrenology. Why memorize information that would be obsolete before she graduated? During classes, Julia practiced contemplative detachment. She observed professors struggling to transmit transitory knowledge to students who would forget everything after the test. It was cosmic comedy about human attachment to passing information. Colleagues took frantic notes. Julia smiled with compassion. They were creating unnecessary attachment to words that professors had read in books written by people already dead, about theories that would be refuted. When the second deadline for TCC project arrived, Julia didn't even remember she had a project to deliver. She was too busy contemplating impermanence of academic deadlines. The advisor scheduled urgent meeting. The professor was visibly irritated. She spoke about academic responsibility, assumed commitments, consequences of not meeting. Schedule. Julia listened to everything with Buddhist serenity. Professor's irritation was impermanent emotion. Academic responsibility was impermanent concept. Consequences were impermanent events. Julia tried to share wisdom about detachment. She explained how professors' suffering came from excessive attachment to transitory academic results. If she practiced impermanence, she would be calmer about inevitable delays. The advisor didn't seem receptive to Buddhist teachings during academic advisory hours. She said Julia needed to choose, deliver project in 2 weeks or look for another advisor. Julia accepted ultimatum with Zen equanimity. Advisors were impermanent. Other advisors would also be impermanent. TCC would be impermanent regardless of who advised. Why attach to specific advisor? Julia spent the following week meditating on the question of advising. She sat in the college garden, observed leaves falling from trees, and contemplated how everything in nature followed impermanent cycles without stress. Trees didn't worry about schedule for changing leaves. Flowers didn't have anxiety about blooming season. They just followed natural, organic rhythm, impossible to be forced by artificial deadlines. During meditation, Julia had profound insight. Why should she follow different schedule than nature? Why force artificial intellectual production when mind needed organic time to mature? But during meditation, other memories emerged. First, psychology class, when she discovered genuine fascination with human mind functioning. Interesting projects she had started but never finished. Stimulating conversations with professors about theories she found relevant. Maybe university education wasn't just institutional attachment. Maybe it was an impermanent opportunity to explore intellectual curiosity through structure that offered resources, guidance, and community of people interested in the same subjects. Julia called her former advisor. She explained that she was re-evaluating her academic approach about impermanence applied to psychology. Something demonstrating that she had used reflection time to develop an original theme. Julia spent 3 days writing a project about impermanence in psychological therapy, how understanding the transitory nature of emotional problems could help patients deal with suffering more wisely. She discovered something surprising during writing. Theory about impermanence worked better when applied to specific problems, not when used to avoid engagement with practical reality. Impermanence of relationships didn't mean avoiding relationships. It meant embracing relationships, knowing they would change constantly. Impermanence. of work didn't mean avoiding work. It meant working without neurotic attachment to results. And impermanence of education didn't mean avoiding education. It meant studying knowing that knowledge would evolve constantly, but taking advantage of the present opportunity to learn while the opportunity existed. Julia delivered the project on the last possible day. The coordination accepted the work as demonstration of renewed commitment to the course. She avoided dismissal by a microscopic margin of a few hours. During the re-evaluation meeting, the coordinator asked about her sudden attitude change. Julia explained that she had understood impermanence more deeply, that everything passed, including wasted opportunities. The scientific methodology professor asked about TCC plans. Julia said she would write about impermanence applied to clinical psychology, but this time she would combine Buddhist philosophy with rigorous academic research. The advisor asked about realistic timeline for completion. Julia presented a detailed calendar with intermediate deadlines, not because she had abandoned philosophy about impermanence, because she had understood that accepting impermanence included accepting necessary temporal structures. Julia returned to attending classes regularly, not out of compulsive attachment to approval, for understanding that impermanence of education made each class more precious, not less important. During the recovery semester, Julia applied impermanence in a completely new way. She studied intensively, knowing that knowledge would be forgotten. She took tests consciously, knowing that grades were temporary. She participated in discussions, knowing that insights would be surpassed. But she did everything with total presence, because if educational experience was impermanent, each moment of it deserved complete attention while it lasted. Julia discovered that true impermanence didn't avoid engagement. It intensified. Engagement through awareness about the preciousness of limited time. At the end of the semester, she had recovered all overdue subjects, not because she had abandoned Buddhist philosophy, because she had found Buddhism that worked within real life, not running away from it. Impermanence included responsibility for the impermanent time we have. A year later, Julia defended her TCC on impermanence and psychological resilience, research combining Buddhist philosophy with scientific evidence about how accepting change reduces emotional suffering. The panel was impressed with the work's originality. Julia had managed to translate an ancestral concept into contemporary academic language without losing spiritual depth or scientific rigor. During defense, Julia explained how true impermanence doesn't avoid commitments. It embraces commitments knowing they are temporary. How accepting the transitoriness of everything makes each experience more meaningful, not less. Important. A professor asked about clinical application of the research. Julia described how therapists could help patients by understanding that psychological problems are also impermanent, that depression passes, anxiety changes, relationships transform. But understanding impermanence doesn't mean passivity. It means acting consciously during the limited time we have to influence positive changes. Julia graduated with maximum grade, not out of attachment to academic results. 4. Having discovered how to use impermanence to improve people's lives, including her own life, the coordinator commented on her impressive transformation during the course. Julia smiled. Transformation was exactly what impermanence taught. Everything changes constantly, including understanding about impermanence. Her parents attended graduation with pride mixed with relief. Julia received her diploma knowing it was temporary paper representing temporary achievement, but it was real achievement during the time it lasted. Because Julia had finally understood, impermanence doesn't eliminate responsible action. It makes responsible action more urgent, including delivering TCC on time. While Julia learned that accepting change doesn't mean avoiding responsibilities, In the south of the country, a freelance designer was discovering that the natural flow of the universe has timing incompatible with monthly bills. Because if there's a profession that transforms wu-wei into excuse for not working, it's freelance work in competitive creative market. Marcelo Flo was at the peak of creative burnout when he discovered he had spent 10 years forcing inspiration like someone squeezing a dry lemon. Freelance graphic designer, specialist in creating logos for companies that didn't know what they wanted, but were sure it wasn't what he presented. The routine was exhausting. Wake up early, triple coffee, open design programs, stare at blank screen until idea appeared by pure willpower. When idea didn't appear, force bad ideas until they became acceptable ideas. When client rejected, force more ideas until finding something that passed. It was constant creative violence. Marcelo treated inspiration like lazy employee who needed to be whipped to produce. Result, creativity increasingly dried up, projects increasingly mechanical, clients increasingly dissatisfied. The breaking point was project for startup meditation app company. Perfect. Irony. Creating Zen visual identity for company that sold tranquility while he was having nervous breakdown because of impossible deadline. Marcelo spent 3 days without sleeping, trying to force revolutionary creative concept. He drank industrial quantity of energy drinks, smoked cigarettes in sequence, and yelled at computer when program crashed for the 5th time. In the end, he delivered generic logo that looked like it came from automatic brand generator for startups. Client approved without enthusiasm, paid miserable amount, and Marcelo realized he had become machine for producing mediocrity under pressure. It was during professional existential crisis that he found book about Taoism in airport bookstore. The Tao of physics was there, shining like divine revelation among business self-help manuals and personal productivity guides. Marcelo flipped through chapter about wu-wei during flight and had epiphany at 10,000 meters. Action without effort. Working following natural flow, not forcing results. Like water that finds most efficient path without fighting against obstacles. Everything made sense. Creativity couldn't be forced because creativity was spontaneous flow. Inspiration emerged naturally when mind was relaxed, not when it was being tortured by artificial deadlines. Marcelo arrived home determined to completely revolutionize professional approach. No more creative violence. Now he would flow with creative process. No more forcing inspiration. Now he would allow inspiration to arrive organically. The following Monday, Marcelo arrived at shared workspace with completely new attitude. He didn't open design programs immediately. First, he meditated for half hour to connect with natural creative energy. During meditation, Marcelo visualized himself as river, following natural course through professional landscape. River doesn't force passage through rocks. It finds smoother, more organic, more efficient path. After meditation, Marcelo looked at client brief with Zen eyes. Instead of despairing about tight deadline, he accepted deadline as part of project's natural flow. Instead of forcing ideas, he decided to wait for inspiration to emerge spontaneously. Marcelo closed brief and went to get coffee. Forced coffee wasn't true coffee. Coffee needed to be savored consciously as ritual of connection with present moment and available creative energy. During coffee break, Marcelo talked with other freelance professionals about wu-wei applied to creative work. He explained how forcing was antithesis of authentic creativity, how best ideas emerged when mind was relaxed, not stressed. Colleagues were interested but confused. They asked how he intended to deliver projects without deliberate effort. Marcelo explained that true effort was different from forcing. It was action aligned with natural flow, not resistance to flow. Marcelo spent rest of morning walking around. Shared workspace, observing how creative energy manifested in environment. Some professionals forced productivity through excessive coffee. Others forced inspiration through stimulating music. all resisting flow. At lunchtime, Marcelo still hadn't opened any design program. Not out of laziness, but out of Taoist wisdom. Projects had natural moment. Forcing artificial moment was violating organic creative process. During conscious lunch, Marcelo contemplated brief without anxiety. Client wanted logo for financial consulting company, serious, reliable, innovative brand. Traditionally, Marcelo would panic and start sketching compulsively. Now he would allow solution to emerge naturally, like fruit ripening on tree. No use pulling green fruit trying to accelerate ripening. Fruit ripens when ready, in nature's perfect time. In the afternoon, Marcelo sat before computer with Zen serenity. He opened design program and observed blank screen without despair. Blank. Screen was infinite potential, not problem to be solved desperately. Marcelo began drawing random shapes without specific objective, letting hand follow natural creative impulses, like improvised dance without forced choreography, shapes flowing through fingers without excessive mental interference. 2 hours later, he had several interesting shapes, but no concrete idea for logo. Marcelo didn't get anxious. It was just first stage of organic creative process. Seed had been planted. Germination would happen at natural moment. Marcelo left shared workspace without delivering anything concrete. First time in 10 years, he finished workday without producing measurable result. But he felt deep peace about creative process that was finally respecting natural flow. Client called asking about progress. Marcelo explained Taoist philosophy about creative moment. Said project was ripening organically, like wine that can't be rushed without compromising final quality. Second week, Marcelo had refined Wu Wei methodology for freelance work. He woke up when body signaled it had rested sufficiently. He ate when feeling natural hunger. He worked only when creative energy was flowing spontaneously. It was complete professional revolution. No violent alarms interrupting restorative sleep. No forced coffee to simulate energy that didn't exist naturally. No forced sitting before computer when mind was resisting creativity. Marcelo created organic routine based entirely on internal signals. Morning meditation to connect with creative flow. Contemplative walk to allow ideas to emerge spontaneously. Work only when inspiration was genuinely present. Clients began questioning new professional rhythm. Marcelo explained Taoist philosophy about quality versus quantity. Better to deliver one excellent project at natural moment than 3 mediocre projects artificially forced. First client to experience Wu Wei methodology was architecture company that wanted to renew visual identity. Marcelo explained that true brand couldn't be created under pressure. It needed to emerge organically, like plant growing in fertile soil of creative contemplation. Company asked about schedule. Marcelo said schedules were human attempts to control naturally unpredictable process. Authentic creativity had its own moment, impossible to be forced by artificial calendars. During first week of project, Marcelo spent most time meditating on essence of client. Company, not compulsive research about competition, not forced brainstorming about concepts, just deep contemplation about brand energy. Marcelo visited architecture companies' construction sites. He observed how architects worked, how they interacted with space, how they solved construction problems, absorbing work essence without pressure to transform observation into concept immediately. Client called asking about tangible progress. Marcelo explained he was in creative absorption, phase. That rushing this stage would compromise project's final quality, that great wines needed time for adequate fermentation. Second week, Marcelo still hadn't opened design programs. He was in conceptual digestion phase, allowing observations about company to settle in creative consciousness before trying to materialize in visual forms. Marcelo spent days drawing in notebooks without specific objective, abstract forms, random textures, spontaneous compositions. like creative. Warm-up, preparing fertile ground for when true inspiration decided to emerge. During contemplative walks, Marcelo observed city architecture, how buildings interacted with natural light, how spaces flowed organically or resisted flow, absorbing visual references without rush to apply knowledge. Clients scheduled face-to-face meeting to discuss progress. Marcelo arrived with folder full of abstract sketches and philosophical explanations about organic creative process. Client expected presentation with concrete logo options. Marcelo showed contemplative drawings and explained how each form represented energetic aspects of company, how curved lines reflected fluidity of architectural process, how rough textures symbolized construction materiality. Client was confused, asked when they would see real brand proposals. Marcelo said real proposals would emerge when creative maturation process was complete, that forcing premature presentation would abort natural project. Gestation. Third week, Marcelo finally opened design programs, not from external pressure, but because he felt creative energy was ready for materialization, like fruit that finally ripened and was ready for harvest. Marcelo worked in deep flow for 6 consecutive hours, not forcing ideas, but allowing ideas to flow through him, like transparent creative channel, without excessive mental interference in process. Result was logo that surprised even himself, elegant symbol that captured company essence in way he had never achieved in previous projects. Effortless creativity had produced result superior to forced creativity. Client approved project immediately, said it was exactly what company needed, even without knowing they needed it. Asked how Marcelo had managed to capture brand essence so perfectly. Marcelo explained Wu Wei methodology, how not forcing allowed deeper connection with client essence, how working with natural flow produced more authentic results than forcing through conventional techniques. Client was impressed and recommended Marcelo to other architects. Word spread about designer who worked with revolutionary Eastern methodology. Marcelo began receiving projects from clients interested in differentiated creative approach. Next client was law firm that wanted brand transmitting confidence and innovation simultaneously. Marcelo applied expanded Wu Wei. 1 week of meditation on nature of law practice. 1 week observing how lawyers worked. 1 week digesting information. Law firm client got impatient, called asking about concrete deliveries. Marcelo explained that premature deliveries would compromise final quality, that authentic law practice didn't rush judgments, so authentic brand shouldn't be rushed in execution. Lawyer didn't seem convinced by legal analogy applied to design, said he had deadline for brand launch. Marcelo replied that deadlines were human constructions that didn't respect natural moment of creative processes. At end of month, Marcelo had delivered 2 excellent projects at organic moment, satisfied clients, preserved creativity, eliminated stress. Wu Wei was working perfectly for freelance work, until bank account began showing unexpected side effects. Third month of professional Wu Wei, Marcelo discovered that universe's natural flow had timing incompatible with Brazilian banking system. While creativity flowed organically at contemplative rhythm, bills arrived at much more accelerated and less zen rhythm. Marcelo opened bank statement and found financial reality that wasn't practicing Taoist philosophy. Checking account had entered state of resistance to natural money flow. Specifically, it was resisting money outflow for basic bill payments, rent, electricity, internet, health insurance. None of these companies had adopted Wu Wei methodology for billing. They continued operating in old paradigm of compulsory monthly payment, regardless of debtors' natural creative flow. Marcelo tried to explain to building administrator about organic moment for rent payment, said that freelance professional income followed natural cycles, like tides or seasons, that forcing artificial payment would compromise financial harmony. Administrator showed no interest in financial tides. She presented Bill with interest and late fees, suggesting that her financial harmony depended on punctual payments, regardless of Eastern philosophies about organic money. Marcelo began experiencing existential tension about incompatibility between Wu Wei and modern capitalism, how to practice non-effort in system that demanded constant effort for basic survival. During meditation on financial dilemma, Marcelo had profound insight. Maybe Wu Wei included efficient action when action was necessary. Maybe non-effort didn't mean non-action. Maybe it meant action aligned with real needs. Insight was quickly rejected as Taoist heresy. Wu Wei was specifically about non-action, about allowing universe to solve problems through natural flow. Forcing action to solve financial problems would be returned to old paradigm. Marcelo decided to trust completely in universal flow. If he was practicing Wu Wei correctly, universe would provide adequate financial solution, as it had always provided solutions for problems throughout human history. New client called offering big project for restaurant chain, complete brand, applications, launch campaign, generous budget that would solve financial problems for several months. Marcelo was tempted to accept immediately, but he resisted capitalist impulse. Project needed to be evaluated through Wu Wei criteria. Did it align with natural creative flow? Did it allow organic moment? Did it respect contemplative process? Client explained tight schedule. Restaurant openings were scheduled for 2 months. Brand needed to be ready in 6 weeks for graphic materials. Production. Marcelo explained Taoist methodology about creative moment, said 6 weeks could be sufficient if creative flow cooperated. But he couldn't guarantee, because authentic creativity didn't follow conventional schedules. Client was worried about uncertainty, asked about backup plans. Marcelo said backup plans were manifestation of lack of trust in universe, that if project was destined to happen, it would happen at perfect moment. During negotiation, Marcelo maintained Wu Wei principles rigorously. He didn't make concessions about methodology. He didn't accept pressure about deadlines. He didn't force agreement that would violate natural creative process. Client gave up and hired traditional agency. Marcelo accepted loss with Zen serenity. It was sign that project wasn't aligned with his flow. Universe had protected him from commitment that would compromise creative integrity. Following week, 3 collection letters arrived. Phone was cut off for non-payment. Internet would be suspended in 48 hours. Marcelo began questioning whether universe was really taking care of his practical needs. During meditation about growing financial crisis, Marcelo tried to maintain faith in Wu Wei. Maybe it was spiritual test. Maybe universe was purifying his life of unnecessary material attachments. Cut phone meant fewer distractions for creative contemplation. Suspended internet would force deeper connection with internal creative process. Overdue bills were opportunity to practice detachment from material security. Marcelo spent week without internet, creating speculative projects on paper, returning to artisanal roots of design before technological dependence. It was purifying experience, even though involuntary. Former client called on neighbor's phone, offering small but urgent project. Marcelo explained he was in temporary creative retreat. That cut phone was part of artistic purification process. Client didn't understand artistic purification as business strategy, hung up confused and hired designer who answered phone normally. Marcelo began selling equipment to pay basic bills. First extra monitor, then printer, then tablet. Each sale was practice of material detachment. Fewer possessions meant fewer distractions from creative flow. When he sold main computer, Marcelo had moment of existential doubt. How to practice digital design without digital equipment? How to deliver projects without basic tools of profession? During last night in apartment before eviction, Marcelo meditated on apparent failure of professional Wu Wei. Maybe he had interpreted philosophy incorrectly. Maybe non-effort didn't mean non-work. Or maybe capitalist system was incompatible with ancestral wisdom. Maybe modern world didn't allow authentic contemplative life. Marcelo slept on mattress on floor, surrounded by moving boxes, contemplating whether Wu Wei only worked in Tibetan monasteries. At his mother's house, Marcelo had time to reflect on interpretation of Wu Wei that had led to creative and housing bankruptcy. Sitting in childhood room, surrounded by posters of bands that no longer existed, he began questioning whether he had confused Taoist wisdom with disguised laziness. Mother brought breakfast with that face mothers make when 37-year-old son returns home talking about Eastern philosophy. She asked about plans to rebuild career. Marcelo tried to explain that plans were resistance to natural flow. Mother sighed, said natural flow included paying rent and eating food that wasn't from her refrigerator. That Wu Wei could be very zen, but electricity bill wasn't paid with meditation. During conversation with Mother, Marcelo had inconvenient insight. What if Wu Wei wasn't about avoiding action? What if it was about efficient action without unnecessary resistance? Like water that flows around stone, but still reaches destination. Marcelo spent week rereading Taoist texts with different perspective. He discovered interpretations he had completely ignored. Wu Wei wasn't total passivity. It was action aligned with natural moment, without forcing results that weren't ready to emerge. Farmer practices Wu Wei when planting in right season, watering when necessary, and harvesting when fruit ripens. Doesn't sit waiting for plantation to grow alone. Acts according to natural needs of process. Marcelo realized he had used Wu Wei as excuse to avoid inconvenient aspects of freelance work. Client prospecting, deadline negotiation, basic financial management. He had called resistance to flow what was simply professional responsibility. Former client called offering small project for corporate event. Marcelo almost automatically refused explaining about contemplative retreat, but stopped and asked about details. It was simple project, reasonable deadline, cash payment. Marcelo accepted, not out of financial desperation, but because project naturally aligned with his capabilities. Wu Wei included accepting opportunities that flowed organically. Marcelo worked on project using mother's borrowed equipment, applied creative contemplation, but within real schedule, meditated on event essence, but also responded to client messages promptly. He discovered that true Wu Wei didn't eliminate deadlines, made work within deadlines less stressful. When you're present for tasks being executed now, you don't get anxious about delivery that will happen later. Client was satisfied with result and speed, recommended Marcelo to other events. Word spread about designer who had found balance between contemplative creativity and professional efficiency. Next client was technology company that needed visual identity for productivity app. Perfect irony, creating brand for efficiency tool after almost going bankrupt from Zen inefficiency. Marcelo applied reformulated Wu Wei. 1 week of contemplation about essence of healthy productivity. Not neurotic productivity he had practiced before, nor disguised passivity he had experimented with later. During creative process, Marcelo worked in deep but responsible flow. Moments of contemplation alternated with moments of practical execution, like breathing, contemplative inspiration, productive expiration. Result was brand that captured balance between efficiency and well-being. Logo that suggested movement without rush. Progress without anxiety. Client approved immediately and asked about availability for future projects. Marcelo explained new methodology. Wu Wei applied responsibly. Creative contemplation within realistic schedules. Natural flow that included competent professional management. Client was interested in philosophy behind work. Marcelo explained how true Wu Wei didn't avoid responsibilities, embraced responsibilities more efficiently without unnecessary resistance, like swimmer who doesn't fight against current, but uses current to reach destination more quickly. Flow includes direction, not just random drift. Marcelo began rebuilding career on more solid foundation, Wu Wei as efficiency tool, not as excuse for inefficiency. Contemplation as part of creative process, not as substitute for creative process. New clients arrived through referrals, all interested in designer who combined Eastern insights with Western delivery. Philosophy that worked in real world, not just in self-help books. Marcelo rented small but adequate apartment, bought basic but functional equipment, organized routine that included morning meditation and responsible financial management. He discovered that Wu Wei included taking care of practical bases of life, like Zen gardener who meditates on nature of plants, but also waters them regularly. During meeting with client about project for Jim Chain, Marcelo applied Wu Wei as deep listening, heard real needs of company without projecting preconceived solutions, let briefing emerge organically from conversation. Result was project that surprised client with precision. Marcelo had captured brand essence because he had let client reveal essence naturally without forcing answers through standard questionnaire. Client was impressed with process and result. Asked about methodology, Marcelo explained Wu Wei as total presence for what client really needed, not for what designer thought client should want. At end of first quarter of responsible Wu Wei, Marcelo had rebuilt career on more sustainable base. Contemplative creativity working within competent professional structure. Wu Wei didn't run away from life. It improved how life was lived. A year later, Marcelo had created methodology that combined Taoist wisdom with reality of modern freelance work. Wu Wei design was contemplation applied to real commercial needs. Each project began with meditation on brand essence, but meditation had defined deadline. Deep contemplation followed by efficient action, like breathing, time to inhale, time to exhale. Marcelo maintained regular hours in shared workspace, not out of neurotic rigidity, but out of Wu Wei applied to time. Routine created sustainable flow, not unsustainable chaos disguised as spontaneity. Clients sought Marcelo specifically for differentiated methodology. Designer who listened deeply, worked consciously, and delivered punctually. Eastern philosophy that worked in corporate meetings. During presentation to client about brand project for wellness clinic, Marcelo explained how Wu Wei influenced each stage. Listening without judgment to understand real needs. Creation without forcing to allow organic emergence. On-time delivery to respect client's schedule. Client-approved project and methodology. Said it was first time he felt designer really present during creative process. Present for company needs, not for own creative ego. Marcelo paid bills on time, lived in adequate apartment, worked with modern equipment, not out of abandoning Wu Wei, but out of Wu Wei that included taking care of necessary material bases. Because Marcelo had finally understood, action without effort doesn't mean absence of action. It means action aligned with real needs, without unnecessary resistance, including inconvenient need to pay bills. Roberto discovered that mindfulness includes responsibilities. Julia learned that impermanence doesn't eliminate consequences. Marcelo understood that Wu Wei works better when it doesn't run away from reality. 3 people who transformed ancestral wisdom into modern escapism, who used deep philosophy to avoid superficial problems, who confused spirituality with irresponsibility disguised as transcendental insight. Because there's difference between authentic Dharma and spiritual procrastination. True Dharma doesn't run away from inconvenient life. It embraces life, including boring parts like spreadsheets, deadlines, and irritating need to actually do something useful. Real Buddhism doesn't eliminate responsibilities. It teaches how to embrace responsibilities without unnecessary suffering. How to live present, that includes taking care of future. How to accept impermanence by acting consciously during limited available time. And if you've already used meditation to avoid work, like this video, if you've already transformed philosophy into excuse to procrastinate, subscribe to the channel. Because authentic Dharma has inconvenient characteristic. It works even when tested by reality, including when reality includes bills to pay.